So that became a really interesting project because the stuff that we were moving was actually national security level data. And so taking those risks were really fun, but that's when you suddenly realize that there's this whole community out there of open source and the use of open source was a lot cheaper. But then if you tell me what the biggest benefit was for the government, it wasn't really the financial situation, but it was a lot. When it came to the financial institutions, implementations of the core banking with MIFOS, that was one of the things that we did actually pitch in as part of the convincing process for the executives. Because I would say, like, how do we know it's going to work? It's kind of like, well,
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Gotti,
Open source is interesting,
Claire Dillon,
great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
freedom,
Stephen Wally,
good engineering,
Austin Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future,
Gregory Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom,
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
We have Federico Gonzalez Waite with us today, and we will talk about open source as always. But today we will explore open source from a government's perspective. We've done that in the past with regulations and legislations, but today we will focus a bit more on what happens when the government decides to use open source. Before we dive into this topic area, Federico, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your background in tech and what do you do currently?
Hi guys and everybody watching. Thank you for having me today on the podcast. Just like you said, I'm Federico Gonzalez Waite. I have just left the Mexican government. I had been working within the federal government for about 9 years, leading several institutions in the government. I was for a while at the Ministry of Agriculture, then in Foreign Affairs. Then I went through to be an advisor at the National Strategy Office for the Presidency of Mexico. And my last post, which I just recently left, was the CEO of the National Research and Innovation Center of Technology for the country. And that was like all those roles were really interesting. And I think they link completely to open source initiatives, because in all of those roles, we were actually launching technology based on open source. Also, if we look back at agriculture, over there we did the National Registry for Agriculture Producers. That was kind of like a first ever project that was done. And it was done 100% open source and 100% cloud computing. So that was quite a big moment, because it was about 8 years ago that we launched that. And although Mexico is big, we still managed to locate a lot of points for registration of agricultural producers nationwide. And that was a project that was pretty much about 6 million people registered. So we've been doing like those kind of projects. At Foreign Affairs, we did something to do with the electronic passport. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about those kind of things. But kind of like everywhere that we've gone or have been one of these promoting voices of open source in the government. Although there was a lot of resistance in many ways, I was one of the ones pushing it forward. And then when I had the opportunity to lead the National Research and Innovation Center of Mexico, that became one of the pioneering points, that we needed to develop a whole lot of open source platforms and infrastructure, because we were not just limited to actually developing platforms and systems. We were also doing our own cloud capacities and our own PBX. And I am a true believer that there's nothing that open source cannot do. You just really need a lot of time and a lot of money sometimes, especially when you're doing like these big projects for the government that needs to be scalable and massive. But I think that's one of the true things that I love about open source, that everything's possible and you're not limited by anything. I can probably tell you a little bit about how I got into open source. And that was by mere accident. I am not an engineer by education. I'm actually an international business and marketing bachelor, and with a double major in that. And then I studied public policy in Tel Aviv University, and I was actually focused into environmental conflict. So somehow life took me on a path where I returned to Mexico about 10 years ago. I joined a software company based in the city of Querétaro, and they specialized on the implementation of ERP platforms that were based on open source. So somehow I became their marketing and sales director. And I remember sitting in a room listening to the founder and CEO of that company talk about cloud computing and open source and a synchronization of data and databases and data lakes and blah, 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 and all these kind of things that I was sitting there going, what is he talking about? So I remember actually like sitting down with a notebook, and as he blabbed on about how amazing the technology that we were selling was, I kept on writing these topics of saying like, okay, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. Don't know what this is. And then I would go back into a conference room that was my office at the time. And I would just start researching. And I did some research and more research and more research. And I pretty much became a self-taught techie. And somehow from that company, he was the one that invited me to join him at the Ministry of Agriculture. And all these things that suddenly became things that I understood and know became a very big cornerstone of the work that I would later do in being one of the people that was driving technology in the country. Mexico was pretty much set up in the last administration with about 4 technological leaders, we can say. One was the National Strategy Office in the presidential office. He was the one that I reported directly to. Then there was an agency that is called Internet para Todos, and that is an agency that was focused on getting internet connection and connectivity to those places in Mexico where it's not commercially viable to get internet. So instead of waiting for a commercial to suddenly decide that there's enough people to get contracts and do it, and the government was going to do it, so we could actually do a real democratization of the content and accessibility online. Then there was the National Research Council for Science, Technology, and Humanities, who we also reported to because we were sectorized under them, and they were the ones driving research, innovation, and these kind of things in all fields of technology. And then there was Infotech, the National Research Center for ICT, which I was the leader of. So pretty much we were the 4 agencies that were driving a lot of this technological innovation in the country. Infotech was very special because we were a self-funded agency, or we are a self-funded agency because the agency still exists. And so we made, the agency makes money by selling services to government agencies and private sector. So it's quite of an interesting role for a government agency to operate like this. But we were not also limited to selling all these services. We actually, it operated in 4 areas. So one was infrastructure, one was a software fabric. In infrastructure, Infotech actually has the largest data center in the government, in the country. And now collaborates directly with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all these big players as well for allowing cloud services. Then we also did academic studies. So it offers postgrad studies. And within that, we actually included open source development as a technical superior a course that lasted for 2 years. So that was also quite pioneering for the country that we actually had that. And that was part of 4 other superior technical studies programs, one in cloud computing, cybersecurity, and data center operations as well. And that was a wonderful project because we were also able to collaborate with El Salvador to give them these courses. And today, El Salvador is teaching about 6,000 or more Salvadorians these courses. And so that's something that really cool because it's also like that impact on the region and not only in Mexico, and also the promotion of using open source in the region. And then the last area that Infotech worked in was research and innovation. So we were also developing technology because we wanted to transition the country from being a consumer of technology only to an actual producer of technology, and started being a little bit sustainable and self-dependent. So we developed everything based on open source, of course, payroll systems, GRPs, IPX, email, and a whole lot of other things. So it's there was some really cool things. So that's a little bit about me and kind of like what I've been doing for the last couple of years.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Indeed.
I would like to go back to that conference room though a little bit. You said which was your office at the time when you first learned about some technologies and open source. So when you went back and you started your research, were you focusing on researching the technologies that you just heard about, or was that research also big chunk focusing on what this whole open source thing was?
I think it was a little bit about everything. I don't think it hit me how important and how big of a movement open source was until I got to the government. And especially when it came to the financial impact that this meant for government agencies. Because when you started looking at the procurement processes and how much countries, and this is like not limited to a single country, just governments spend millions or billions of dollars in licensing costs. And when you look at how much you're paying, and sometimes it's even like when you go to payroll systems, well, they're paying a big amount of money per employee. So when you have a very big government structure, that means a lot of money. And so that's kind of like when it hit me that it's like kind of like this financial impact that it had on the governments and the operation of agencies. And then through that, and especially the time at Infotech, we started collaborating with different communities. Well, and that's when you can actually grasp how big this is and how much this community vibe that exists. Well, because we started when I was, for example, I think the first time that we actually started collaborating with one of the communities was in foreign affairs. We had a paid database. I will not say the company because I really don't like them. But it's one of those big ones that charge you a lot of money. And I remember that one day they went to threaten us and said, like, if you cancel the contract, the whole agency will fall down. And I was kind of like, well, maybe that will work with somebody else, but I've already done this once and nothing happened. So I'm happy to try it again and see what happens. Nobody will die, I'm sure about it. And then we started talking to some people in one of the communities that they really came to us and they said, like, we're happy to advise you for free just because we want to push the use of open source. And we were migrating everything into a Postgres database at the time. So that became a really interesting project because the stuff that we were moving was actually national security level data. And so taking those risks were really fun, but that's when you suddenly realize that there's this whole community out there of open source that are like-minded people that also want to do things a better way, and they are just interested in pushing technology, that are actually willing to go out and help you out and advise you and give you tips on how to do this and that. And it's not even because they want to make money out of it. It's just because they're passionate about it. And that they're true believers that it can happen. So that just led to conferences and input, open infra, and all these kind of things. So that has been, I think it's been a really great ride, and you meet really interesting people like you guys.
you talk a lot about, how the government is using and investing in open source. Were you part of the group of people who set this up, or was open source already in use by the government by the time you got there?
See, the government has been trying to use, and I'm saying trying to use open source because a lot of the time they were developing their platforms using open source frameworks. But a lot of these frameworks or platforms, they were actually in control of a third party. So the vendor that actually developed the technology generally was the one that that controlled and knew how everything was. So when we went into agriculture, we tried to do things a little bit differently. And we actually made it that whatever was developed by the software fabrics that were being hired to do these developments would actually become part of the agency's goods. No, and that's something that kind of like carried on. I served during 2 different presidential terms. So that presidential terms spoke about the use of open source vaguely, and they recognized the power of using cloud technology, and that was accepted on a legal basis for personal data. But that was pretty much it. So it wasn't until the Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador government came into power that that actually open source became part of the agenda. I was fortunate enough that during the transition process of government, I was able to meet them, and they saw the work we had done in regards to open source at the Ministry of Agriculture, and they invited me to stay on. And it was with them that we were able to do some really great projects. But it was also with them that that legislation started to change. So, for example, there was this whole idea, of like, let's reduce costs. There was a austerity plan that was launched. So that was a very big, important part of seeing how we could apply this austerity plan to technology as well. And there was a lot about talking about technology sovereignty and creating our own capacities in the government, not only in regards to technology, but also in regards to talent. And this is why like these programs in open source development and cybersecurity were very important, that the government actually started these programs in order to get younger people to start launching into these kind of topics. Like I mentioned, we wanted to transition from an IT consumer to being an IT generator, but that's when like the legislation came in, and this legislation that's very clear. It's still part of the law right now. So if we, for example, if we talk about one of the pieces of legislation, it was the kind of like the policies and the guidelines that were issued by this agency in the presidential office about how the administration do digital government and the procurements. It actually says that institutions may implement open source software. And this was kind of like done because it was always like this kind of thing, like, we can't do it, no? Then there was also the General Law for Humanity, Science, and Technology that again spoke about digital sovereignty and this technology being able to be open source. And then on the actual austerity legislation, it said that agencies should promote the use of open source when possible. So I think this was a very big game changer, and for policy people around the world, I think this is a good example about how Mexico has been able to actually regulate in favor of, and this doesn't mean that like big complicated like satellite systems and security systems have to be open source. There's still space for those to be private because they're highly specialized. But basic things that can actually be built in-house and that can help you reduce costs and get that cost spent otherwise, that's kind of like the things that are being promoted. So it was really this past 6 years that have just finished in October, the ones that were pushing forward this agenda, because it was policy. Then that meant that a lot of the government agencies had to go that way. There was also a lot of work done in changing CTO's mindsets and decision makers, because a lot of the time you hear open source and everybody goes, open source, it's open, it's free, it's cheap. It doesn't work. or it's not safe. So we did a lot of work in kind of like making people understand like what's the process in designing an open source solution, like from the definition of the requirement to the actual development of the platform, the testing, the cybersecurity analysis, everything that took place in order to be able to put it in front of a public service official or a citizen, and be able to get them to understand how all these processes and kind of like the benefits and all these kind of things. At the end of the day, most of the times, I think when you're talking about these open source implementations or any technological implementations, from my experience, I've discovered that it's never a tech problem. It's generally a people problem, and it's always a change management problem. So that's kind of like always the big challenge. But I think we moved forward really, really well in Mexico. A lot of agencies have started using open source technology. And I think that speaks that these kind of like regulations were beneficial for us. And that has redirected a whole lot of the budget that was before spent on these expensive licensing and these multinational companies that generally don't give anything back to the country, into other things, because there's never enough money in government. So always when you can spare a couple of dollars here and there, that makes a big difference somewhere else.
There are a lot of companies and organizations out there who say that we may or may not use open source. Sometimes they don't even know how much open source they are using, but investing back and giving anything back to the community, it seems like charity, overhead, additional cost. So they are not doing it sometimes with the notion of this costs too much money that we don't have. Did you ever run the numbers in terms of savings because of going down the path of using and relying on open source software and maintaining it, some of it maintaining it yourself, investing in the maintenance of it? So have you ever run the numbers, and is it consistently showing that, so to say, it's worth it?
When we did one of the big projects, and I probably can't give that much details, so it's a little bit confidential, that one. But like we did do it kind of like per project basis. So we would kind of like draft up how much, and especially when you look like maybe at financial institutions, well, a lot of their technology operates on mainframe. So by the time that you actually release yourself from the need of using mainframe and being able to go into either a cloud or x86 infrastructure, then there's a big cost reduction. So we kind of like used to do the exercise of, okay, running this technology for the next 3 years is going to cost this much. No, mainframe, licensing, maintenance team, because anyway you need somebody there to look after the technology, and especially when you're running mainframes, there's internal processes that need to be run every night, and end of the month and end of the year, and adjustments and all these kind of things. So we used to do kind of like that tally, and then we used to do the tally of the new technology. And also, how much is it going to cost to implement this open source solution? How many hours of development? How many support personnel are we going to need then? How much is going to be now the infrastructure? And the cost difference was incredible. Of course, then there would be a lot of the question of like, okay, well, we update the technology to a new license program. Okay, then let's do, instead of doing just current proposed, let's do the alternatives, And we would do the same exercise, like, okay, how much is it going to cost to implement? What's going to be the licensing? What's going to be the infrastructure? And the use of open source was a lot cheaper. But then if you tell me what the biggest benefit was for the government, it wasn't really the financial situation, but it was a lot about freedom. Because if you own the technology and you're not married to a license, and you just need to change your support partner, then you can do a whole new procurement and get rid of the one that you've got if you don't like him anymore. Because there was a lot of situations where these vendors that had been there for years they control the agencies. And so just being able to get this freedom and this sovereignty and being autonomous, because now also because it's an open box, we can document all the technical information. We can have our technical manuals, we can have our user manuals, and then we can have our own people in the agencies that maybe they're not going to be the all-rounder that can do the whole work, but at least they're going to have knowledge of what they're operating with. And that, I think, was the biggest benefit that as a country, we started getting by impulsing the use of open source technology, because it wasn't only like the platforms, it was also the infrastructure. So we started migrating a lot of stuff into OpenStack and started using Kubernetes and all these kind of like nouveau technologies that I don't know why we were not using anymore, which are not that nouveau. But that also had a very big implication, because instead of having these very expensive infrastructure contracts and having to buy and renew very expensive infrastructure, we had this flexibility. And then we also started getting this flexibility to move to the cloud. So actually there was a frame contract that was issued by the past administration, where it made it a lot easier to hire cloud. And it was an open thing, so you could actually choose which one of the cloud providers you would like to work with. It wasn't married to a specific one. And also Infotech was able to create these relationships directly with them, so we could also provide those kind of services. So that was the opportunities that open source gave us, I think, were limitless. And there's a lot of work that, thanks to what was done in the last 6 years, the guys that are coming in now to do the next 6 years, there's a lot of stuff that they're going to be able to reuse, that they're going to be able to piggyback on and make things a little bit easier and efficient, and keep on developing the digital transformation of Mexico, because I think we are one of those countries that we're big enough and that we do need to be transforming, and especially because of the proximity that we have to the US and the collaboration that we have with a lot of countries. We can't fall back on technology, and we need to keep on developing. And it's also one of those things that in the country, like when they start seeing the federal government doing something, then the state governments start doing something about it. And then once the state government starts doing something, then the local governments start doing it. And so then before you know it, this digital transformation starts to trickle down, and we have a very big impact. And then private companies also have to start doing it. So it's kind of like a way to drive forward this ideology. And hopefully, like what we'll see in another 6 years is that there's a lot more of this open source technology, and that this kind of like government community keeps on growing, and that hopefully these kind of like blind spots where we're still not sure about how to work with other communities that we could really benefit from, they actually start being a little bit clearer, and there's a little more definitions. And then hopefully this can keep on going in Latin America and other places. And that we can be an example, I think, because I find it really interesting how like we are regulating towards open source, and then you look at another countries and they're actually discussing regulating against. So I don't know if we're going against the wave, or we're actually seeing something that they haven't realized as well. So that probably is a big question of how we can keep on this growth.
When it comes to the learning part, the fact that when it comes to open source, it's not just the documentation and the code that is out there, but also the people and the communities. Do you know if it was helpful to the people who had to learn all these new things, that they had access to the community as well, and experts in the community who've been working on the code and technology before these new people started to try to learn all these things?
Making them aware of that existence was also complicated, because I remember, like, especially when we were launching our cloud, I remember having one meeting with our technical team, and it's kind of like, we can't fix this and we can't make this work. And it's like, have you Googled and gone to forums? I am sure somebody in the community has had this issue, has found a solution, and has published about it. And they would suddenly go like, oh no, we haven't done that. Well, so just making them aware that like there's this whole world of information out there that if you Google it or go to a forum, you're very likely to find it. That was also quite interesting. Once they started doing it, then it was incredible how fast we would find solutions to the problems. Well, like, okay, we're like trying to implement this here and this doesn't work and it's clashing and somehow I'm losing registries, but I went to a forum and there's this solution. So it's going to take us about 2 days to implement the solution and we'll see if it works. 2 days later, what happened? It kind of worked. Okay, it's better than not working at all, no? So it was interesting getting them to be aware of this. Like I said before, like when we were doing these big migrations of data, having these friendly community members that were there for a phone call and just like being able to call them, that's something that has helped us all the way. I am not sure if everybody was doing it, but I was certainly the one that suddenly would run into a technical meeting and say like, this is not working. And I would say like, I think such and such will have a solution. And I would literally pick up the phone and call them and say like, hey, I'm here with the team. Can you take like a phone call for like 10, 20 minutes? Like, yeah, of course. Okay, we're in this situation. This is what's happening. And like straight away, they would tell us like, okay, it's probably this, it's probably that. Or they would definitely tell us, we have never seen this before. So I'm coming over tomorrow. And that was really cool because it helps you a lot. And I think that's one of the big virtues about the community, that we're always happy to share how we're finding solutions, and we're happy to help each other because we're like-minded. And this is something that I think like open source is kind of like a complete different culture. Like you could say like we are like, to a certain extent, we're our own tribe. And unfortunately, people that are outside the tribe have no idea what's happening inside the tribe. And they probably just look at and say like, hey, this is like all these freaky techie people that talk something that we don't understand. But then I think if people invested time in understanding what goes in the tribe, it would make them a little bit easier to accept the tribe. No, and that was something that was amazing.
Tell me about your experience here. Tell me the successes and the magic that you've used to explain to people who don't understand that there's a world and an ecosystem where you get better support by not having a support contract than the world where you have paid money so that you have this SLA and you can point to this thing with somebody on the hook to provide answers to you. How do you explain to somebody that one model that has no obligation whatsoever seems, for some strange, unintuitive reason, to work as well as, if not better, than the paid version? How do you explain that?
I think that's the $1 million question. I think if I had the correct answer, I would be a lot busier than I am right now, than that I've been. No, I think it's just, I think it's really interesting because even when I talk to my partner about going to the conferences, no, and just now that I was in Indianapolis, it was like, no, because I'm hanging out with these guys, and like we went to lunch and we're talking about this, and she's like, but do you know these people? It's like, no, like I knew one of them. I met them at another conference, and like we spoke and chatted and blah blah. So, like, so why are you hanging out with them? It's kind of like, because that's what we do, because we've got common interests. And she's kind of like, is that normal? It's like, yeah, that's very normal. Suddenly, like somebody that you spoke to in a conference, like you might not see them for years, but you suddenly like send them an email or send them a message, and you keep in touch, and you're talking about the same kind of things, and then you see them again. It's kind of like, that's why I say like we're kind of like our own tribe, and only the ones that are in the tribe understand the tribe. And so yeah, like this kind of like interactions are very, for outsiders, I think they're quite uncommon sometimes. But also like this, a lot of people are not aware about the forums, and they're not aware about the support ecosystem. When it came to the financial institutions implementations of the core banking with MIFOS, that was one of the things that we did actually pitch in as part of the convincing process for the executives, because they would say like, how do we know it's going to work? It's kind of like, well, should work. And if we can't find the solution, then there's this whole support network in Africa, in the UK, in Brazil, in Middle East that are using that technology. And if we don't have the solution, we can ask for their help. And they didn't kind of like believe us at the beginning. And then we did have an issue with the payment systems for the transfers. And we were not able to find a solution for it at the time. And we were short-staffed as well, because also having the right people for open source is also difficult sometimes. And so we actually like called up and started getting a couple of favors, and it turned out that somebody somewhere in the community did have something that would help us. So it wasn't the whole solution, but they gave us this component that then we could build upon, and then we could actually resolve the whole thing. So I think that's kind of like one of the examples where we did have to kind of like use it as part of the pitch. But it's I think it's very difficult. It's kind of like making everybody around the world understand what actual cybersecurity is. For us, it can be pretty clear and pretty easy, and actually, but for other people, you're talking gibberish.
I think events get so, I don't know, underestimated and underappreciated so many times. Like I still remember having to fight for being able to go to a conference sometimes while I was working for Ericsson. I mean, I do understand it has a cost, and if everyone all of a sudden goes to conferences, then who's going to do the work? And it also costs a lot of money to go to a conference. But at the same time, like when you go out and have a beer at the social hour with someone, that person will be the person who picks up the phone or who answers your chat ping and will either have a solution for the question that you have, or will at least probably be able to point you to a direction that is useful to you to be able to find a solution. So making those connections can be just so invaluable. It's amazing. Like it changes people's lives, making those new connections, that new network of people that you know all around the globe.
Yeah, and that's just it. I mean, how do you explain again to a manager that's responsible for that travel budget that it is enhancing your support contract that doesn't exist because you've created this informal social connection with the guy who wrote the software that you're now depending on, right? And that social connection is just how he's going to be quite willing to pick up that phone when you give him a call, because he knows who you are and you've had that interaction. I mean, these are all of the non-formal things that happen in this open source collaboration ecosystem that are, as you say, Ildiko, they're critical, right? To be able to get that approval to go. And we all know that there's significant difference in the productivity of developers, right? This is well documented for a long period of time, and having that connection to be able to answer questions and help in getting things resolved, that's adding to the productivity of the developer. So when you think of the cost of the developer, how much that is, and then you compare that to the cost of sending them to an event where they can get those kind of connections, I mean, you're upping the percentage of the guy's productivity or gals and the person's productivity. So but those are, again, these are all fuzzy concepts. We know them from experience and history. Explaining it to somebody who's not part of the tribe or part of that world is really difficult.
Maybe an easy way is like the same way that you need to go and do networking events to create sales. Well, you need to do networking events to create knowledge and collaboration.
Well, but there again's the problem, right? Because the sales guy can argue that, his ability to network is a direct connection to the revenue generated. And this also is another problem that falls back with open source, is how do you make money on open source? Well, you don't, you save money, right? And this is a way of productively saving more money by, giving your developers this set of resources, which are the connections that they make.
And I mean, at the same time, like just imagine a larger community, OpenStack, Kubernetes, a lot of people in the community, but even more people are looking into the technology and trying to ping someone in the community. And if you're an expert in any of the components of these large open source projects, then you're probably being pinged by a lot of people. So who you're going to respond to, the complete stranger or the person who you had beer 2 weeks ago at an event? You probably pick the person first. I'm not saying that you never respond to the newcomer, because that is not true. But if it's a busy day and I get 10 pings, I will probably respond to the person I know, because I want to help them. And I know them. So it's just kind of a human thing to do. So in that sense, your connection of getting that support that you need will just be way more efficient. And at the same time, which companies probably don't want to hear, you will probably start to become part of that ecosystem who has the knowledge. So you will be pinged by people, but then you always learn something, whether you're the person who pings someone or you're the person who's being pinged and asked. Both people always learn something new, so that knowledge base just grows. So that way, that investment really does pay out, but it's really hard to put into numbers. Before we depart, Federico, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech, open source, governments, some kind of a hobby or a fun fact?
Fun fact about myself, I think something that people find really, really weird sometimes is that I'm a Mexican Kiwi, and I was actually brought up between both countries. So I am culturally mixed and confused a lot of the time. But amongst all that confusion, I can tell that I'm a true Kiwi because I love rugby and cricket. And I can show them a real Mexican because I actually used to be a Mexican charro, which is the Mexican cowboy. So when you see these images of Mexicans with a lasso and a big hat, well, those were the kind of things that I used to do when I was younger, and I'm still a big horseman. I love animals. I love horses. So that's something completely different from what you would imagine from somebody in tech.
That's amazing. I love that. Like you're multicultural, even in upbringing. That's very nice.
And it comes through in your accent. The Kiwi, when you're speaking English, the Kiwi accent on some words comes through.
The twang is always there.
Yeah, the Kiwi accent is hard. I was in New Zealand once and I lost my wallet, and there were people who were trying to help me, and I had to ask back so many times that I felt so embarrassed. Like, just could you repeat that sentence just once more? Maybe a little bit slower, just a little bit slower. But yeah, I mean, I think I got the hang of it by the end of the 5 days that I spent in New Zealand. But yeah, I had some challenges with that one.
Well, I think it's like any language that's widely spoken is going to have its different versions. But hey, that's normal for us. But then also within New Zealand, I think we have like different kinds of like accents. Like certain people speak some way, other people speak another way, so it changes, and that's what I can be challenging for somebody going in to visit. And they were also incorporating a lot of words from Maori language. So it's actually by law, both languages are official. So for example, our passports, they come in both languages, and now the language is very present. So like if you go to an airport, like you have toilets, and you also have wharepaku, which is a word for bathroom, and then suddenly people will talk to you, and say like certain words that are not familiar for other people that are not from New Zealand. I did learn it at high school when I was there. At the time, it wasn't that kind of like enforced into the educational system. For example, my nieces now do have to take Maori studies, so they're like a lot more fluent than I am. But I am still like, there's certain things that when I hear them, I can pick it up.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you